This is Cultural Debris with host Alan Cornett.
Christopher Scalia, welcome to Cultural Brief.
Thank you, Alan. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
You are coming to us from the nation's capital, I believe.
That's right. As you can see from the skyline behind me, I'm from wonderful downtown Washington, D.C.
That's right.
Where
the currently semi-occupied, newly safe
That's right.
capital.
Crime-free for the past 12 days or so. It's funny.
Well, crime-free except for the government. So
that's good.
That's the like government has a monopoly on violence. They also want a monopoly on crime. So.
I was on the Washington Mall last week with some friends who were visiting from out of town, and the National Guard presence was pretty noticeable, I have to say. And it is. I work in DuPont Circle. I saw yesterday. I was walking around the block and saw some tourists speaking to members of the National Guard. It was all. It's different, but I for one do not feel threatened.
We need to have a DC police, like an Americanized version of like the British Beefeaters, that stand around.
Oh, yeah.
They could be dressed in like colonial garb, have powdered wigs or something, and I think it could add to the tourist charm of DC.
Well, I went to college in just across the street from Colonial Williamsburg, and
that's right, yeah.
The charm of those powdered wigs and tri-corner hats they really bring the tourists in that way.
Was that something that was sort of a dress code for students, that you had to come to class in a
fortunately
and a powdered
not.
wig?
Yeah, we did not have to. Plenty of students, or I don't know the exact number, but some students did work in Colonial Williamsburg, but rarely would they actually show up to class wearing their candle making costume.
Well, that's a little disappointing, but
yeah.
But nonetheless, and you, we're going to talk about your new book here, which I have a physical copy of. But you're writing about novels, but you are an actual genuine literature guy. I mean, you have real degrees in that.
I do, and a couple of fake ones too. But yes, I have.
They're from University of Wisconsin Madison, so that.
Yes,
so
I have a master's and a PhD from UW Madison.
Studied behind enemy lines.
I did. I have to say I really enjoyed Madison. It was politically not my home, but some very good advice I got from a mentor when I was applying to graduate schools was to choose a place where you want to spend your 20s, because if you're in a humanities PhD program, you're going to spend basically a decade there. So
That's true.
less than a decade, really. So Madison was a good place to live.
Well, the beer scene is very good in Wisconsin, and they also have the highest per capita consumption of brandy in the country.
Did not know that. That surprises me.
True. Yeah, but they make a very questionable old fashioned. So speaking as a Kentuckian, I'm a bit of an old fashioned purist, and I don't approve of the Wisconsin old fashioned. But that may be, they put like Sprite and things in it. Muddled fruit, they put Sprite in it. It's just not good. It's really not an old fashioned. It's something else, some mysterious third thing that's not what it should be.
It's funny you mentioned that. One of my favorite restaurants and bars in my last years there was right up on the Capitol Square, and it was called the Old Fashioned. And I think that was probably the first place I actually had an old fashioned. So I didn't know better whether it was up to any sort of standards at all. But
it might be questionable whether you actually had one there. I mean,
that's possible. Something claiming to be an old fashioned.
Get you to Kentucky, and you can have a proper one. I actually had a pretty good old fashioned at the Mayflower Hotel Bar in DC. So I know that they have an okay one. So
I might head down there right after this.
Yeah, you should. I mean, why not? The streets are safe. So you have written this book. I'll bring it back out. This is why we're talking
Yeah,
today. 13 novels. Oh, wow. There's one there too. 13
no
novels
avoiding it.
conservatives will love, but probably haven't read is the parenthetical subtitle. So you begin the book with an anecdote in your introduction about buying a book that might be of interest to some of our listeners, and so I'll turn it over to you and let you tell us about buying this book long ago.
I tell this story of a time I was at the UW-Madison bookstore, which, as I mentioned in a footnote or an endnote, is where some of the classic film Back to School was filmed in the early 80s, starring Rodney Dangerfield.
I saw that in theaters.
There you go. Some of that was filmed at UW-Madison. And I was at the bookshop, and I'm sure I had a reason to be there, but as is often the case in bookshops, I found something that I wasn't looking for, but it seemed more interesting than what I was looking for. It was Russell Kirk's anthology of the Portable Conservative Reader. And I flipped through it. I had heard of Kirk, obviously. I didn't know a ton about him. But I knew he was a significant figure in conservative intellectual circles. And the collection was wonderful. Just as I skimmed through it, it had some things you would expect, like Federalist Papers, and passages from Reflections on the Revolution in France. But it also had some poetry and some fiction. It had a great short story, fable really, by Nathaniel Hawthorne, Earth's Holocaust, which I write about briefly in my book. And so I scooped it up, and as I was waiting in line, a classmate approached me, and he saw the book I had and gave me a weird look and said, "Conservative reader, what could be in that?" Or something along those lines. But very clear, the point was, how can a book of conservative thought possibly be over 2 pages? You know, conservative intellectual is sort of thing like military intelligence, that kind of oxymoron. So I thought that was a good way to kind of illustrate attitudes about conservatism, but also kind of the just to suggest how formative this book was on me in some ways as a cradle conservative. It kind of got me as a cradle conservative. I did not think about I didn't know as much about conservative, foundational texts, I guess you could say. I haven't thought about them as deeply as maybe I should have. And so this was a good way into it, and also a good way to recognize that great literature, like the poems and stories included in that Kirk collected in there, could also convey conservative principles without really being too preachy and without proselytizing. And that in particular was a real inspiration for this book, guiding readers to great fiction, great novels in particular, that are great by any literary standard, but also convey conservative, or at least depict conservative ideas and themes sympathetically and thoughtfully, without being preachy.
That book is interesting. Of course, the Viking portables used to be a big thing. I have other Viking portables. I don't know if they're widely in print anymore or not. But I have a few that I've picked up here and there. But back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, they were a pretty dominant anthology series, and so it was impressive that they had Dr. Kirk do that book at all. I mean, it's interesting, and I think he was the right person to do it, because just because of exactly what you say, he includes a lot of things that I think a less imaginative editor would not have included.
Yeah.
And interestingly, in his book of letters, and it's been a while since I've looked at them, so I don't remember exactly what all was in there, but he has a letter to Buckley. You and I were discussing William F. Buckley a little before I hit record, but he has a letter to Buckley where he's informing Buckley that he's having to cut out a piece that he had selected by Buckley for the Portable Conservative Reader, because apparently Viking made him cut it down by like a third
Oh,
from
wow.
what he
Yeah.
had, which he was lamenting. But of course, it's not a thin book as it is. It's
exactly. It's barely portable.
Yes, it's barely portable as it is, and it would be interesting. That it would be interesting to see. One suspects. I don't know that the list is in the book. He mentions some authors, I think, but to be interesting. And I mentioned this to Cecilia Kirk Nelson one time. I should re-mention it. Of compiling the lost pieces from what is volume 2 of the Portable Conservative Reader that didn't get included, because they should have that in the file. But at any rate, so this was an introduction to you that the conservative imagination, we'll call it, was broader than perhaps just a von Mises text, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's, and maybe I'm overstating it there as an introduction, because I was familiar with the conservative mind, so I already had a pretty good sense of this. This was just probably more accurate to say an expansion of something I already knew. My father had recommended the conservative mind to me, I think when I was in college, and that was that had been a very influential work on him. I still have his first edition copy of that.
Very nice.
And I don't use that one. I use a
understand
a hardier paperback edition for my own reading. But yeah, it was the reason I think Kirk and Buckley are such significant figures to bookish conservatives and literary minded conservatives, because they recognize the significance of great literature as vehicles for ideas. It's reductive to call them only that. Obviously, they're not only that, but that is something that great fiction can do, and they both knew that especially well. And I have to say, I love one of the reasons I love Kirk in particular is that we share a love for Walter Scott. Kirk calls I have a chapter in this book on Walter Scott's Waverley, and I quote some of Kirk's praise for Scott, but Kirk called him his literary mentor. He praised Scott for conveying the principles that Burke wrote about in Reflections on the Revolution in France in a much more accessible way, and reaching many more readers than Burke ever could have imagined. So I always appreciated that element of Burke's thinking as well. Or sorry, Kirk's thinking.
Well, since I have this in my notes, but since you've brought it up, we'll talk about it now. The Waverley novels, which is one of your, or I guess Waverley of the Waverley novels, is one of your 13 recommended books. Of course, Waverley's probably the third most well known of his. At least it's at least as far down as third, because I think Ivanhoe is probably number one.
Yeah.
Rob Roy probably second, partly because of movie adaptations. And so forth. But the series of novels that he wrote are actually called the Waverley novels. That's the titular novel of the series. But they were of not only more import in the 19th century than we probably imagine today, because he was sort of he was on a popular level like Rowling or a Stephen King would be today, I think, in a lot of ways. I mean, he was a popular level novelist, but he's writing high fiction, which of course says a lot about the reading level of people of that time. But there was his legacy endured in that he captured the imagination, particularly of a young Russell Kirk, whose mother would read the Waverley novels to him when he was a boy, and also he kept reading them throughout his life. He would just reread through the Waverley novels. And when I was an assistant for Dr. Kirk in just a couple of years before his passing, he was again reading through his set of the Waverley novels. But you also bring up, and something that I had not, or if I'd known it, I had forgotten it, that St. John Henry Newman was greatly influenced by the Waverley novels as well.
He was. He credited Scott with first of all, he acknowledges Scott was anti-Catholic, as many people, many Britons were at the time, and he didn't have nice things to say about the Catholic Church. But Newman still credited him with kind of firing one's imagination and showing that there was basically kind of hinting at metaphysical realities in his novels that would lead one down particular roads, which of course St. Newman ended up following. But yeah, Newman loved him. So did G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton, in an essay about Dickens, spends some time praising Walter Scott as somebody who recognized the greatness in all people. And I think that's one thing that really elevates Scott above some of his contemporaries, is that he wrote about different classes, people of differing beliefs, not in a particularly interesting way, and that gave these different beliefs and classes credit. He was often criticized by people like Mark Twain for elevating the past over the present, and in particular celebrating feudalism. And Twain claims that was a justification for slavery. But I think that's a pretty gross misreading of Scott. What makes him so great and so conservative in his fiction is that he recognized what was good about the past and sought to preserve it, and reminded us what we were losing, even as he acknowledged that the passing of time often entailed progress. So he had no real desire to go from, in the case of Waverley, from the ordered peaceable kingdom of the Romantic period to the Stuart monarchy of that the Jacobites were trying to bring back in that novel. He recognized that in the Burkean sense, gradual change, incremental change was superior to sudden, violent, or revolutionary change. And that, obviously, an important thing to be writing. This case, Waverley is published in 1814, so right at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, like the last throes, basically, of the French Revolution in so many ways. It was an important case for him to be making there. And it's just fascinating to me how much he's been forgotten, really, over the past 50 years in particular. He was still widely read well into the 20th century. Ivanhoe, you mentioned, was a huge movie. Elizabeth Taylor as one of the central characters, and there are places all around the world named after him. But for whatever reason, I think there are a lot of reasons why he's slipped through the cracks. And really, Jane Austen is the only figure from that period we read anymore, apart from one Mary Shelley novel. And I like to complain about Jane Austen, not because I don't like her. I like her very much. I think she is certainly not overrated. But the problem is she sucks all the oxygen out of the room for any other figure from that time, or even some of the writers who influenced her. I don't include any Jane Austen in my book because I don't think anybody needs to be reminded to read Jane Austen.
You think everybody's heard of her?
Yeah, everybody's heard of her. Everybody's been told to read Pride and Prejudice, and they should. instead, I include a novel called Evelina by Frances Burney, who was Burney in general and Evelina in particular were big influences on Austen, and any Austen lover will appreciate that novel. And what I try to argue about that novel, I bring in Roger Scruton with that novel especially. That novel is in large part about the significance of manners, or more broadly, civility, as a sign of respect we show for our culture, for the people who are around us. Even in the United States, we're definitely less formal than they were in 18th century Britain, but we still care about manners. We still care about how people dress in certain situations, and we're probably not supposed to in a democracy, but it's just kind of a human instinct to recognize that manners matter. Appearance in certain situations and contexts matter as well.
I wanted to throw in one more thing about Kirk and Scott. Russell Kirk told me one time that the most important influences on his thinking were Sir Walter Scott and Marcus Aurelius.
Wow.
That those and he read both of them throughout his life, and I think part of the reason why they had such an impact was because they were lifelong companions. And I think Burke's not somebody that a young person necessarily would just pick up and read, but he had read Scott, or had Scott read to him even from boyhood. And I think prior to becoming a Catholic, Dr. Kirk essentially was a Stoic in practical terms. So I think those were the kind of the guiding lights in his thinking, and point to the value to somebody today who's sympathetic with conservative thought or want to understand conservative thought, that we rediscover Scott, because he's and there's no shortage of Scott to read either. There a lot of books.
You mentioned I think his two other. I think Waverley, Ivanhoe, and Rob Roy are the three most accessible. And any one of those three would be a good start. I recently heard somebody refer to Ivanhoe as a pot boiler, which is I couldn't disagree more with that, but it's an accurate description insofar as Scott has a lot of adventure, and the novels can move quickly, but they are not easy reads. They're not light reads. I wouldn't call them that at all. And there are, as I was suggesting earlier, and as Kirk recognized, there are serious ideas in those novels. One of the reasons Scott is so significant a figure in the history of the novel is that he helped rejuvenate the form. It had kind of fallen off critically. It was always suspect critically, but he was writing at a period when it had dropped off especially low. But he kind of re-elevated it by showing fiction could deal with, to use gendered language that would get me in trouble elsewhere, he could deal with kind of masculine themes, masculine subject matters, still bring in some romance though, some romantic subplots, and so appeal to a wide range of readers, draw a popular audience as well as a high critical audience. That it really was an important kind of intervention at that point in literary history.
Yeah, the novel itself, the novel qua novel, was, novel at one time, essentially supplanting epic poetry, I guess.
Yeah.
And the novel is so ubiquitous now, we just assume kind of that's the common form, but it's really a modern invention and a modern way of telling story.
It's Don Quixote is often credited with being really the first modern novel. There were chivalric romances before that, but those were all kind of set in a fantastic past. So really not until the 16th century did you see the novel rise. And in Britain, it really started developing with great force in the 18th century. But the big fear was that because novels were accessible, and it was feared that their audience, Samuel Johnson's fear was that the audience was the young, the ignorant, and the idle. And as a result of that, they could have really pernicious influences on their young readers. So Johnson in particular wanted to make sure novelists were kind of providing good moral instruction, basically, and many of them did. I included Johnson work in here, which is technically not a novel, 1759's long fictitious narrative Rasselas, which is very much a moral work for really targeting young people, and I think it's has many remarkable insights into human nature. But yeah, you're right. We have this idea that the novel is a really old form, but in the context of Western civilization, it's relatively new. Having said that, though, so many great minds since the novel's inception have written novels. You really can't. If any conservative who claims to care about Western civilization and Western culture really needs to take fiction seriously.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that, about just the premise of your book, which is here are some suggested novels. Two things about that. One is they are not the usual list, because you have the premise rather at the beginning of read another book. So tell me about that premise.
Well, my joke is that when I was writing this book, the working title I had was "Read Another Book," and that was a play on kind of the response to a few years ago when every liberal on Twitter would compare any Republican politician to somebody from Harry Potter. Always an evil person, like, well, Trump is Voldemort or whatever, and any good person to a hero in Harry Potter. And it just of course, this was before Rowling became persona non grata to the left. And it became ubiquitous and frustrating. And so people would say, read another book, as in, not everything is about Harry Potter. It's great you loved those books when you were a kid, but it's time to read other things now. And applying it to this book, I've had so many conversations with conservatives about novels, and I've enjoyed those conversations, but it's always kind of predictable about which novels conversations will turn to. Brideshead Revisited by Yves Lenoir, 1984 by Orwell, or Brave New World by Huxley, or something by Ayn Rand. Tom Wolfe. Yeah, you're shaking your head at Rand. No comment. Bonfire of the Vanities by Tom Wolfe. My point is not to say stop reading those books, but what I want conservatives to recognize is that there is a much deeper literary tradition that we can appeal to. My title is not 13 conservative novels, but 13 novels conservatives will love. In part because I didn't want to read, I think it's over-reductive to say that these are conservative novels. But these are novels conservatives will love because they explore themes of particular significance and interest to conservatives and right-of-center readers.
That touches, the way you put that touches on a particular topic of interest of mine, or something that sometimes rankles, is that we as readers, as imaginative readers, one hopes, have to approach literature with the expectation that it's not necessarily simply going to tell us or reaffirm things that we already think. That's not the goal of reading these things. And in fact, it's probably not a bad idea to specifically to read things that maybe you don't agree with. And it might cause you to have unpredictable thoughts or something, and that might not be a bad thing.
I completely agree with that. And that's something I addressed in my introduction. My point is not that these are the only books conservatives should be reading. I think you're exactly right. One of the important things about reading any literature is to encounter ideas, characters, ways of life that are unfamiliar to you. But I suspect that, and that ties to one of the defenses of fiction that people always make, which is that fiction develops what is often called our sympathetic imagination, our ability to understand people who are different from us, to not necessarily agree with them, but at least understand where they're coming from and how they think. So yeah, I think it would be a big mistake for conservatives to only read fiction that they're going to agree with and that is sympathetic to their perspective. On the other hand, I just suspect conservatives, I think there's nothing wrong with reading books like that either. You want a balanced reading diet. And part of that is reading works that that you may agree with. But with fiction, conservatives will encounter different ways of understanding their principles and beliefs. The way you encounter conservatism in the way you encounter Burkean thought in Scott, for example, is different than how you encounter it in Burke. The way you encounter depictions of American identity or arguments about American identity are different in a nonfiction work than in something by Willa Cather. I write about my Antonia in this book. So even if conservatives are kind of likely to agree with the overall perspectives of these novels, it's still a very different way of understanding conservatism or encountering this conservative wisdom.
Now, speaking of Cather, I read Death Comes for the Archbishop. I think it was last year.
Yeah.
Recently, past couple of years. Anyway, it was very moving. Wonderful, wonderful book, and I think she has become somewhat forgotten, even though I remember in high school, again, some decades ago now, but reading my Antonia, actually. So, again, it's kind of like Scott, within memory, people were reading some of these authors, all of these authors probably, most at least, but there has been some drop off with that. You have a quote from Lewis that I liked. Reading old books keeps the clean breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds.
I love that line.
Yeah, it's a great line because and a lot of ways I think people view the old books maybe the opposite way, as rather than being a clean breeze, as being old and musty.
Absolutely.
I don't want musty air. I want something fresh, and by which they mean something that's newly released on the bestseller list or something. Lewis is understanding old books in the complete opposite way of that. What value are these old books in that way? How is it a clean breed?
Well, the way Lewis describes it is that every age is guilty of its own biases, its own prejudices, blind spots, and we recognize that with the past. We don't recognize that with our own time. And so when you're only reading current works with familiar ideas, familiar people, you're just kind of re-immersing yourself in that. It's a very kind of Walter Scottian idea to go back to the past, immerse yourself in the past for a little while. You don't necessarily want to be a part of that time, but you recognize what its virtues were. You recognize you recognize its prejudices and its shortcomings, but you also recognize some of its to go back to that term again, some of its virtues again, some of its strengths, its moral strengths, its intellectual strengths, and that in turn can refresh how you view the present age. But I really like what you're pointing out there. It's that fresh sea breeze is such a great image, in part because it does strike us as a precise opposite of what happens when we open up a musty book.
Yeah, I think certainly that's the modern the modern view. We're so caught up in the present, and I mean, I plead guilty to that as an overuser of the Twitter app.
Mm-hmm.
And what's we have the term for it of doom scrolling, that but you're constantly looking for the new and the fresh, and we become, I mean, it's not even what's on the bestseller list, which may have been something written last year even, but it's what is the tweet of the moment that I need to know. And of course, as you well know, social media has these very short lives of topics. Something will be just dominant in everyone's thinking and everyone's timeline, and then suddenly disappear. At the time of this recording, there's been lots of discussion of Cracker Barrel, for example.
I was just going to mention that. Yes.
Yeah. So everybody's been concerned about Cracker Barrel. By the time this comes out, whenever that is, Cracker Barrel will long be old news, and there will be some new issue that we have not anticipated yet that everyone will be concerned about. Old books bring up old issues that tend to also be current issues, new issues as well, and I think that's important. Well, you've touched on this, but I want to ask this a little more explicitly, because I think that very often there is a resistance, and I think maybe more so among conservatives, something of a resistance to reading fiction. And I saw a tweet. Speaking of tweets, I saw a tweet a few weeks ago or somebody. Well, why would I read a novel when these ideas that I might get from that novel have been, explained far better in some nonfiction book or essay? So why should I read Scott if I can just go read Burke?
Yeah.
If Scott's simply illustrating these principles of Burke, then I'm just better off going back and reading Reflections a couple of times, or other books, writings by Burke that where he's explaining these ideas. So what benefit does Scott, for example, since we're talking about Scott, what advantage does he give me over just Burke alone?
I think one way of understanding it is that in novels, writers can kind of experiment with the ideas in a controlled environment and seeing how they play out in real life or in fictional life. But with the best novelists are able to do that convincingly because they understand human nature. And so that we get realistic depictions of these ideas at work in everyday lives. No, these things did not literally happen, but with great novels are convincing because we recognize the novelists understand people. They understand the human psyche. They understand different types of human character, and how our passions play out, and how we make decisions. They understand our trains of thought and the different ways we can arrive at a conclusion or come to a decision. Rod Dreher put this well a while ago, which is that conservatives, I think you're right, conservatives in particular, conservative men in particular, are wary of fiction because it didn't really happen. It's not really true. And we tend to overlook that doesn't mean it's not a source of wisdom. And as Dreher said, we know we need to win hearts and minds. Fiction is how we get to the hearts. We get to the minds there too, but fiction has an emotional power that I think conservatives especially seem too often to overlook. I worked in public relations for a while, and it was kind of a running half joke there that conservatives were bad storytellers, in part because stories appeal to emotions, and emotions are for liberals, right? Conservatives deal with facts. We deal with real life. And that's true to an extent, but you're not going to convince people. You won't persuade people only with like numbers and data. You need to appeal to the heart, and that's what fiction does. That's what fiction has a particular ability to do. Now, nobody reads a novel to be persuaded. You don't sit down and with a work by your favorite novelist and think, well, I'm gonna read this so I can be persuaded about this or that idea. But a great novelist brings you along and gets you thinking about these ideas. Novelists don't necessarily answer life's big questions, but the great novelists are at least asking the right questions and offering different possible answers to those questions.
I saw a quote some years ago, and I can't remember where I saw it, but it's an apocryphal quote at this point. But basically, the person was saying that he had received the advice that if there is an author whose nonfiction means a great deal to you, if you find out that he wrote fiction as well, you need to read that fiction.
Mm-hmm.
You make the point that both Buckley and Kirk wrote fiction. Of very different sorts, but they both wrote fiction. I mean, Buckley's. I think Buckley's has been a little more transitory. He wrote sort of spy novels like a la Ian Fleming kind of things. I think that's what he was emulating. Kirk was writing ghost stories, fantastic fiction, that sort of thing. But I think both express the thinking of their writers. Are there other writers who we might look at in that way? That I don't know. That's a little far afield of your book. I know.
Well, no, I think with those, I'm embarrassed to say I haven't read any of Kirk's fiction. I've tried some of Buckley's fiction and did not love it. You were referring to the Bradford Oak series, and
right, yeah.
I've read some of his other fiction. But I read more fiction, and so my understanding flips that a little bit, and so when I prefer reading a novelist's nonfiction. And the great examples of that are, Scott wrote a lot of nonfiction, but he has a great essay about chivalry that helps clarify what he's up to in a lot of his novels. But Walker Percy is one example, and I should say, I don't include any Walker Percy in this book because I don't love Walker Percy nearly as much as his biggest fans do. But I don't include any Flannery O'Connor either. But she's somebody whose nonfiction I think is instrumental. I think in understanding, or at least fully understanding or appreciating her short stories. I don't think you need to read her essays to really get what she's up to in her stories, but they really illuminate what she's getting at in really important and useful ways. Those are the ones who come to mind. I write about George Eliot's novel, Daniel Deronda. It's her last novel. That's one of the novels I write about here. And one of that book's main subplots is about Zionism. And so she also wrote an essay about Zionism towards the end of her life. So I bring that in a little bit to elucidate what she's up to in Daniel Deronda and her thinking about that topic. But yeah, I think that basic advice is good, though novelists, it's rare that somebody is exceptional in both those spheres. I guess T.S. Eliot, not a novelist, but his essays are generally regarded as highly as his poems. He's somebody else who comes to mind there.
So you have selected 13 novels here, and obviously we'll leave it for folks to. I'm not going to read them all off. We'll leave it for folks to explore the book. But in choosing these 13, what novels were left on the cutting room floor? There had to be some in the running that didn't make the cut for whatever reason, but perhaps you might consider worthy. Do you have some? We'll call them bonus novels.
Yeah, this I'm going to give you a very long answer for this one.
Okay,
So
great.
let me first explain that these are all English language original novels, and I made that decision in large part because that kept the Russians out. But
very valuable these days. We wouldn't want you to be accused of being a Russian stooge or anything.
No, I needed to limit it because otherwise, really, it would be such an unwieldy project. And there's so many great European novels that I would have had to consider including. And the original project was going to be 10 novels, but I had a hard time just narrowing it down to 10, so I went to 13. I go from the 18th century. I mentioned Johnson's Rasselas, 1759. To more or less the present day. Christopher Beha's The Index of Self-Destructive Acts from 2020. And I did that because I wanted to make clear to conservatives that these novels are still being written. This is still a lively tradition. And this conservative thought is still alive, and great fiction is still alive. I thought that was important. It required making some difficult choices. I did not include. I didn't include any Cormac McCarthy. I think that might be one of my most controversial decisions by the sorts of people who care about this sort of thing. For a similar reason why I didn't include any Percy. I like McCarthy, but I don't like him nearly as much as his biggest supporters, and I would have felt like a phony. I wanted to include something by Saul Bellow because he's such a significant figure in 20th century American fiction. And there's a very strong conservative strain to his fiction. Ditto Philip Roth. But I just don't like Bellow that much. There's something a little too ponderous about his novels. I thought it would have, I just didn't think many readers would like Bellow enough either. So I didn't include him. But for most of these novels I really struggled with, I included them in an appendix I have for every novel I write about. I have in an appendix entry, if you liked this, try these 3 novels. So that's where I was able to get some novels that I had to make the hard decision of cutting out. There also, my specialty was when I was an academic was 18th century and early 19th century British literature. So there were a number of 18th century novels and early 19th century novels that I really wanted to include, but I didn't want to spend too much time in that period because it's so unfamiliar and less successful. Well, as I said, I wanted to cover a long time period. So I limited myself to what I could cover there. And that meant I didn't include a novel I love, Tobias Smollett's The Expedition of Humphrey Clinker, which sounds like an insane novel. It's just a wacky title, and it is a very wacky novel. But it's a remarkable novel that deals with social change, the influence of wealth and commerce on people. It's very, very funny as well. So there are a lot of novels like that that I had really enjoyed teaching when I was a professor, but just knew it was too hard to sell or overstocking the 18th century to include here.
I'll throw in a Russell Kirk favorite, which was the George Gissing's The Private Papers of Henry Rycroft, which is a great novel. If you've not read it, you should read it. He considered it one of his favorite novels, and Gissing's was a sort of semi-failed novelist, I guess.
Yeah.
But and Rycroft is semi-autobiographical. But there are some great passages in there, particularly for the book lover, because Rycroft was a lover of books and would forego eating so that he could buy more books. And so you can tell when you read the book, you see why Russell Kirk liked it.
Yeah, I've heard of Gissing. I've read some Gissing, but I don't know that one. I'll have to.
It's very, very good. I recommend it. And So I'll throw that in as my novel conservatives should read. But a 19th
Well,
century
you're
novel.
also friends with and a fan of Wendell Berry. I
I
don't.
am, and I didn't bring up at all that he's not included.
He's I include him. I include Hannah
I saw
Coulter in
that
the
he made a
appendix.
mention in the appendix.
So tell me
Hannah Coulter.
what if you were if I had enough good sense to consult you as I was writing this book, what Berry would you have recommended I include?
I would like to say that there is a great lack of people with the good sense to consult me about what I think about things, because there's so many problems I could solve.
I know.
Well, I think you and I may have touched on this when we were in Grand Rapids, but I mean I think Jayber Crow is his masterpiece. Although a book that I recommend to people who have not read Berry is as a little bit of an on ramp for Berry is a collection of short stories. They're thematic short stories. They're all around a particular couple, but a book called Watch With Me, which actually came out, it may have come out right after Jayber Crow, but it's a collection of short stories that follow the life of a farmer named Ptolemy Proudfoot and his wife Minnie. But they are also very, very funny. They're told in this sort of rural Kentucky, and that's probably a reason they appeal to me, a sort of rural Kentucky humorous way. But they're also very touching. And I think, and they're, each chapter is really a self-contained short story, and they're lighter, standalone, so they're easier for people to kind of bite off. Jayber Crow is a bigger book in a lot of ways than that is, but I think that it's a very good way to ease into Berry. I get that not everybody. I think probably Berry is like Cormac McCarthy, that his biggest fans like him more than you do. But
that is accurate. Yeah.
But I think that Berry is well worth reading, and I think that there are a lot. Well, no question that there are a lot of conservative themes. Although Berry himself has a very love-hate relationship with conservatism as such. I mean, he's politically was raised, as most Kentuckians of his age were, in a heavily Democratic state where republicanism as a partisan movement was something that they did not agree with. He's sort of grew up in sort of the old FDR New Deal kind of time. So it's a different approach, and so I think that also underscores an important thing to think about, that reading fiction and nonfiction for that matter, people with conservative tendencies don't need to get hung up on partisan labels, like Democrat and Republican, that those really don't have any currency to me when it comes to good fiction. At least if you're talking about good fiction, they're not going to be there. A good novel is not going to be one that follows an election where a Republican wins. I mean, and I think that that's probably a place where the right, maybe we'll say, capital T, capital R, have often fallen short when they've attempted to be somewhat didactic with fiction. Fiction has to have less agenda than that. And I think that that's where Berry shines, because I think that in some of his fiction, and nonfiction too, he probably is more conservative than he maybe even consciously thinks that he is. So,
that makes
although
sense.
he's very conservative, small c conservative, he describes himself as a traditionalist. So, which I think is is a safe word for him. So,
yeah, it's you bring up an interesting point because I don't know the politics of some of these authors, and I'm pretty sure some of them would not have considered themselves, certainly wouldn't have considered themselves Republican.
right.
To name two of the two authors still alive, I write about Leif Enger, Peace Like a River, fantastic 2001 novel. Not many people have read this novel, but I've never met anybody who's read it who didn't love it. And I include it in my book because it touches on really conservative ideas about family, gratitude, and faith. I have no idea what Enger's politics are. I know he works for public radio in the Midwest, so I assume he's left of center. But I still think this is a novel conservatives. In fact, all the people I know who've read it are conservative, and they all love it. And Christopher Beha was an editor at Harper's for a while. I know he just converted to Catholicism. He spoke at Hillsdale last year, so he's conservative adjacent, but I don't really know what his politics are. I haven't seen him. As far as I know, he has not written nonfiction about politics. I include a Muriel Spark. Yeah, exactly. I include The Girls of Slender Means by Muriel Spark. I don't know what her politics were. I know she didn't like Nixon, but a lot of people didn't like Nixon. So
I did. Speaking of Nixon, I bought a Nixon bobblehead when we were in Grand
Rapids. You didn't get the Gerald Ford one?
I did not get the Gerald Ford bobblehead. As tempting as that was, I got the Nixon.
Yeah. So
he's looking at me.
but I think it's important. And I do think you're right that conservatives. There's plenty of preachy left-wing literature.
Oh, sure.
I mean, there's no doubt. But it's funny. Generally, conservatives are a lot more patient with entertainment and media they disagree with than liberals are, and that's in part because we don't have a choice. If conservatives only listened to, for example, pop or rock music that by artists whose politics they agreed with or that expressed sentiments they agreed with, then we wouldn't really be listening to anything. We'd still be listening to like Pat Boone. So we can't really boycott, the same way the left can, except for the case of Cracker Barrel, as we were discussing earlier. But
Cracker Barrel has felt our wrath.
Yeah, the great conservative accomplishment of the year. But it is. I do sense that. I hope that from this book, conservatives who are interested in writing fiction recognize that it is possible to write novels that convey traditional or conservative ideas without proselytizing, and by keeping a focus on sophisticated characters, complex characters, and good compelling plots, and working with the ideas, but not oversimplifying the ideas. There are. I said again, going back to my title, novels conservatives will love. One of them is Zora Neale Hurston's "Their Eyes Were Watching God." That's probably the novel that is best known in this collection, probably just ahead of My Antonia. And it's so well known because Hurston, when she died, was not. She was an obscure writer by then, but she was an important figure in the Harlem Renaissance. After she died, the novelist Alice Walker basically rediscovered her, resurrected her career, and she was initially re-embraced, I should say, as a black feminist novelist. And so the left loved her, and the left still does love her. I include her in this collection in part because she was deeply conservative. I do know her politics, much more about her politics than some of these other novelists. She hated communists. She was a Republican. She bashed the NAACP for all sorts of reasons. She loved Booker T. Washington. She subtly celebrates Booker T. Washington and Their Eyes Were Watching God. Conservatives should know about this. It does not mean she was not a black feminist. There are strong feminist elements to Their Eyes Were Watching God, but I think they're more complicated than probably people have interpreted them in the past. And again, people who have read this book previously probably aren't aware of the conservative context of Hurston's life and some of what she's up to in that work.
Well, complicated, I mean, I guess kind of the whole point of the book and our discussion is complicated's good. I mean, we want complicated because real life is complicated. I mean, that's, getting back to Russell Kirk, that's the reality of sort of a non-ideological approach to life, which conservatism is the opposite of ideology, that there are not clear-cut systems that work. That's a progressive notion that conservatives recognize and embrace the complexities of life, and that there aren't easy answers in a fallen world. And good literature recognizes that and deals with that, and that you're not always going to find a neat, happy ending because life isn't like that either. I'm going to throw out two more recommendations from a single author. This is my small list of books conservatives should read. Fred Chappell, who is a North Carolina novelist and poet, wrote actually did a trilogy. I've gone blank on the third novel in the trilogy, but I'm One of You Forever and Bright in the Corner Where You Are two fantastic novels that that conservatives especially, but anybody should read. I think they'll enjoy them. But and they're not written in any kind of partisan way. There's no politics that I know mentioned in them, but they're fantastic, very moving novels. And the main character is a small boy, and it's his growing up. So sort of a growing up trilogy for this small boy, and he adopts a lot of. I'm going to need to rely on your literary training here. The South American sort of fantastical,
magical realism.
He pulls in some magical realism elements in his fiction, which is interesting. Writing in a North Carolina context, but he's clearly embracing some of that. Well, I want to ask you. Go ahead.
Let me stop you there. So I know Chappell is a poet. His poem Midquest is kind of recognized as one of the great, really Appalachian poems of the later 20th century. I don't know him so well as a novelist, so I appreciate those suggestions. And you mentioned magical realism. I should add that Leif Enger's Peace Like a River is one of the reasons it's so fascinating. Is that it's adapting magical realism to a specifically Christian context. So I call it miraculous realism. But there's definitely a very strong element of that.
Well, I guess if you like that book, you might like Fred Chappell.
Yeah, I should check that. In which Chappell novel in particular did you say?
Well, I would.
You said a trilogy.
It's a trilogy, but the first two, and I may have them in the wrong order. I'm One of You Forever and Bright in the Corner Where You Are.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So speaking of Appalachia, that's a good transition. You yourself lived for a time in Appalachia, not too far from where I grew up, but on the other side of the border.
Yeah.
So tell me about your time in Appalachia.
I was a professor at the branch campus of the University of Virginia in Wise County, Virginia. It's called UVA's College at Wise. It's just across the border from Kentucky and about an hour from Tennessee. I grew up in Northern Virginia. I thought the state ended at Roanoke, but there's another 3 hours southwest. And I was there for 8 years. It's a small public liberal arts college, about 2,000 students. And I enjoyed it. It was not. I left because it just wasn't a great job, and I wanted a better job. And ended it. But there wasn't one available in the academy, so I left academia. But that was a tough decision for me. I liked it there. It was completely unfamiliar to me. As I said, I didn't know about that part of the state. I'd never really spent any time in Appalachia. And I grew up upper middle class. This was you know, a less affluent part of the state, and it was I don't know, it was just good for me to be there, good for me to see to be around very different people. You know, Wise County was a coal county, and as you may have heard, coal is not what it used to be. So
yes,
it was.
I've heard
Yeah.
heard about that.
So it was, you know, it was certainly a less affluent area than where I had grown up, or than Madison, Wisconsin, where I had gone to grad school. But they, you know, the university was trying to help with that. And then, you know, there was a big kind of the hospital was also a big employer down there. It's also just beautiful. I loved the I loved the landscape. I loved the pace of life very much. One of the things I dreaded about moving back up to DC in Northern Virginia was the traffic and the pace of life, and I'm still often kind of readjusting to that. But I enjoyed my time in Appalachia. I started my family there. 2 of my children are born there. So yeah, that time meant a lot to me.
Well, Wise, Virginia is about as opposite culturally as you can get from Madison, Wisconsin, I would
yeah,
I would imagine.
It was. It's funny in Madison. So if listeners don't know, my father was Antonin Scalia, the Supreme Court justice. In Madison, I didn't really announce that. And when the response I got so often in Madison was, if I remember one time I was giving my last name to somebody was buying something and they needed my credit card. So I gave my last name, and she said, oh, not like the justice. And I just said, yeah, like the justice. But I didn't say I was related. I just said like the justice. And then she went on a little rant about how much she disliked the justice, et cetera. And I kept my mouth shut. It wasn't worth it. But there were a lot of
you got to do what you have to do when you're behind enemy lines. So,
and especially when she still had my credit card.
Right, correct. Yeah, so, very good point.
There were a lot of encounters like that. But then when I visited Wise for the first time, I was at the airport in Johnson City, and the agent behind the desk recognized the last name, asked if it was like to justice. I said yes. She asked if there was any relation. I said yes. And she went on a, I guess you could call it a little rant about how much she loved him, how great he was. So it was a very different experience. And politically, certainly in a lot of ways, I felt more at home in Wise County than I did in Madison.
Yeah, I can see why. Christopher Scalia, the novel, not the novel, the book about novels is 13 novels conservatives will love, but probably haven't read. So they have no excuse now.
Yes,
they know about them. This is from Regnery, the old conservative publisher.
Right. Alan, can I say one more thing about my title?
Of course.
Don't be ashamed, dear readers and listeners, if you have not read these novels. That was kind of the point. Right, I hadn't read many of these novels until I started working on the book. So that I had heard of them, I was aware of them, and the book was a great opportunity to finally sit down and read a lot of these books I'd been meaning to get to for a while.
Well, I think a lot of times, you know, we get fixated on the big book by a particular author, and their other books may be just as good, just didn't click for whatever reason. Yeah. So anyway, some good stuff there, and of course, bonus books in the back. Thanks for being on. We appreciate it.
You're welcome, Alan. Thanks a lot for having me. It was a lot of fun talking to you again.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Thanks.
All right.